Jeff Pettegrew, I've joined him in ARAWC. He's part of this Partner Source 2018 conference here. I was amazed in 3 o'clock hour. You kind of broke down the history of workers' compensation, and it goes all over the place. If this was a Jeopardy question for $1 million, I would say, what are you talking about? I have no idea what you're describing. But if you missed that, let's kind of review that real quickly, the history of workers' compensation and pretty much as we know it today and where it started.
Yeah, for our listeners of the first hour, I talked about the original roots of workers' compensation, and few people realize it started in 2050 BC in ancient Samaria, okay? And what they were talking about is what we would refer to as impairment. And this is the foundation of workers' comp that everybody has to understand. Impairment, by definition, it means you lost your finger. You lost your arm, you lost your leg, you lost a body part, if you will, and that's worth money. It's converted to money. And then you throw in some compensation, you throw in some medical, and maybe a little bit of rehabilitation. You bundle it all up. It's what we call early workers' compensation, and little of it's really changed. And then we got into the pirate story. I told you about how pirates compensate, all their crew members, and they had a specific design for each body part. 100. It would cost you 100 pieces of 8 if you lost your hand, and 600 pieces of 8 if you lost your arm. And by the way, 100 pieces of 8 was a whole annual salary in the U.S. So it was a pretty lucrative business. And you'd swab decks and cook if you couldn't go back to your normal job. So we saw a lot of the roots. It's kind of entertaining to look at that. And then we got into the more serious side of things. It was like, well, what about the modern part of history? When did it really come back in a formal form where government actually created the rules and regulations? And I talked about the history really coming out of Prussia when von Bismarck, the chancellor then, was getting a lot of pressure from the Marxists back in 1894. And in order to appease them, because he was going to get thrown out, is he came up with this system, and he said, don't worry, workers, I got you covered. And here's what we're going to do. And we're going to give you the system I just kind of described. And he said, but we got to protect the employers. And so we came up with this sort of grand bargain concept, which means we'll give you all this, but you can't sue your employers. And I think the listeners have been listening for the last hour. You've heard that there's a difference between the workers' comp system and, of course, the Texas injury benefit option, where you certainly can.
Yeah, absolutely. Jeff Pettegrew joining us on the show. Let's talk about ARAWC real quick.
Yeah, ARAWC's a really interesting organization. It was. I think Bill was giving the history of last 30 years of the injury benefit program in Texas and how it's evolved. Again, for listeners to understand, this is the only state in the union that has this. This is an incredible opportunity. It's made Texas so great because the other states, all they have are traditional workers' compensation programs. So in Texas, you get to choose, and you can have traditional workers' compensation. And for some employers, hey, that's great, no problem at all. But in others, they get to choose this injury benefit program. So ARAWC came about in 2014 as a way to organize that effort. They said, hey guys, we really need to get together on this, and we need to talk about, the good, bad, and the ugly. What can we do? How can we improve it? We also need to defend ourselves because, like anything else, you get a good idea, you're gonna get criticized by those who are, making money from the other competitive systems. And most of this criticism came from out of state, interestingly enough. But the fact of the matter was that, we have a lot of companies in Texas that are national companies or even international companies, and they've taken the plunge and said, look, we're gonna follow this Texas option. So ARAWC came about and said, look, let's make some moves so that we can educate ourselves and make sure that the program continues to improve. And I'll tell you what, they're doing that, Brian. It's great.
It is great, and I've heard some of the bullet points on this. It makes common sense. You get injured on the job, you want to have swift action, you want to have swift investigation, you want to have swift reporting of the action. Let's go over some of the other benefits.
Right, and you heard about accountability if you were listening earlier, and so here are the key benefits for those of you who are out there. I think Bill has shared with your listeners that about 20% of the workers in Texas right now are covered by an injury benefit program. Most of the others by workers' comp. God forbid the others who don't have anything, because that is an true opt-out if your employer doesn't have any coverage at all. But again, let's look at the injury benefit program. So in an injury benefit program, as opposed to the Texas workers' comp program, and this is just for comparison purposes, so you understand, and like most other states, if you're injured, Here are a few of the things that happen, and a lot of people wouldn't know this because you haven't had a workers' comp claim. So Jeff, what's going on here? What happens? Okay, so you're injured. First thing that happens is you report your injury, okay, and then they send you off to a workers' comp doctor. And you say, well, what's a workers' comp doctor? Well, they have panels that are pre-selected because only a portion of the medical community will even treat workers' comp claims. Because why? Because there's fee schedules, there's ADA guidelines they have to follow, and in some cases they'll get an employer doctor versus an employee doctor or an independent medical examiner, which is between the two, and it becomes a contentious, it can become a contentious system. So they're thrown into that situation. Here's an issue too. Well, what about my wages? Well, in the Texas Injury Benefit Program, which ARAWC represents, for the most part, you get your wages right away. There's no discontinuation of wages. The wages continue. I think Bill outlined that earlier. But in the workers' comp system, in all states, including Texas, there's a waiting period. You say, why is that? Well, I can't tell you exactly why, but generally you're gonna wait a week or possibly longer. It varies by state before you get your first check. And you're going, well, wait a second. I'm not going to get paid for a week or so? Well, you may get a retrospective check ultimately, but you're going to be without payment for a while. So that was one of the things we wanted to do in the injury benefit program, is say, well, that's not fair. The poor injured worker, is struggling for their family and trying to make an income. And so in most cases, they're going to get their wage replacement right on. There's not going to be an interruption at all. So that's the first thing to consider. And the other thing is that because there's immediate reporting, they're on it right away. And I think you've heard testimony from other people here at the conference that, they're going to send you to the best docs. It's not just a workers' comp doc. It's going to be the best docs possible. Heard stories about people that were injured, for instance, in El Paso, that were flown up to Houston or Dallas for specific surgeries. Because the medical facility wasn't sufficient for the kind of complicated injuries that they had. There's no boundaries, what I'm saying. I've also heard that, for instance, they needed a caregiver, and the caregiver in one case was the spouse of an injured worker, and so she was going to school. So the story was this: they said, well, look, we'll pay you to be the caregiver, but we know you're going to school. So what they do, they paid her, and then they gave her a scholarship after he went back to work. It's kind of like in the workers' compensation, the law says you pay for transportation to the doctor. We might buy you the van.
I love that. And of course, coming up later, we'll talk a little bit about kind of a charity, a kind of a nonprofit that's been formed through all of this. We are broadcasting live at the Omni Park West Hotel for the Partner Source 2018 Employers Conference. We're talking to Peter Pettegrew with ARAWC. Thanks for the cookie, by the way. I know they were cleaning up the food line there, and you thought you'd bring that.
I heard you talking about the big cookies, and I couldn't resist. I thought I better grab one for you, Brian.
Yeah, not a bad cup of coffee as well. For more information on ARAWC, best point of website. Good.
Right. We're at arawc.org. And please come to our website. It gives you more information about the program. And we're there to answer any questions at all. And as a spokesperson, I'm available to business groups, too, that, might want to hear more. And I'm writing articles, and we can give you information and whatever you need.
There you go. All right, we'll take a break. Give us a few minutes. We'll come right back. You listen to 620 AM.